Welcome to Masters of Color, brought to you by lowpost.com and ravengrade.com. I'm your host, Cullen Kelly, and my guest today is Peter Doyle. Now, I am especially excited about this episode because Peter Doyle may well be my favorite colorist of all time. In addition to his credits on films such as Inside Llewyn Davis and Darkest Hour and the Lord of the Rings series, Peter is a true digital intermediate pioneer with a deep technical knowledge that he harnesses in support of his creativity. We have got an awesome conversation in store for you today on the art and the science of grading compelling images. This episode is sponsored by pixelview.io, a streaming solution that provides both a high-quality live feed of your grade as well as a built-in video chat, facilitating easy collaborations that make for happy clients. Emailing files to your clients and getting written feedback back can be a hassle. With color, it's often easier to show than to tell. You can use promo code MASTER to get a 15% discount on a hardware encoder at pixelview.io. In the meanwhile, let's check out my conversation with the one and only Peter Doyle. Hey, Peter.
How are we?
Good morning. Doing great.
Where are you?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Well, it's impressive you're up early, although you'll be doing your Tai Chi and you've already had your little run, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got my, I get my best work done at this hour, man.
Very good.
And you're already well into your day. It looks like you've already got some grading done over there.
Yeah, well, kind of. Well, there's a lot of shooting happening, so there's an awful amount of dailies to check.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this morning. I'm really excited to be talking to you and maybe a little bit nervous because you're one of my heroes in this world of color grading. So very, very happy to be chatting with you this morning.
Well, that's a little scary. Okay.
But we can both be a little scared and a little nervous.
Very good.
Man, I mean, so where do we begin? You obviously have an incredible resume and body of work as a colorist, going all the way back to the very advent of the digital intermediate and digital color grading, and even prior to that, starting with, films like The Matrix and Dark City that really pushed into that space and were complicated color grading workflows above and beyond being digitized, just with the amount of control you're exerting over the images themselves. And then, of course, The Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter films, Inside Llewyn Davis, Edge of Tomorrow. I'm literally just listing a handful of favorites because there's so many that you've worked on. But I guess one of the questions that came up for me as I was reviewing your body of work is wondering how you calibrate your eyes to all of these different genres and forms that you've worked in, from fantasy to action to family to period, documentary, adventure, like all these different genres. How do you calibrate your eyes to the needs of a project and the genre that it's playing within?
Okay. I think the first thing is to really define what your or my role is in the little kingdom that is each film. And if we think of each film as its own little kingdom or state or dictatorship, depending on the ambience at the time, I think what you really, or I guess I'll just speak about myself, hopefully not third person. What you really need to do is to define exactly what it is expected of me. And typically my role is to provide the technology and the workflows that allow a production designer and a DP and a director to create a world. And ideally that's normally created on set, obviously. And the very essence of filmmaking is obviously to record that, whether it be on film or digital or whatever. Now, that process inevitably becomes interpretive because you are now capturing reality And just by the very nature of it being a technology, it will no longer be completely real. And that interpretation fascinates me, because depending where you sit, I guess philosophically, you could argue that technology should never dictate the creative process. But likewise, the creative process is completely and utterly influenced by the technology, simply because if we take at the absolute most basic, if we really trim it way back to the essence, you'll have a production designer and a DP and a director create a world on set, let's say a green wall with a black-skinned actress. That on set looks the way people want it to look to their eyes. But because we're making a film, we're actually filming that or recording that. So that at that point, you are exposed to technology. And there's a very interesting intersection between, well, do you let the technology drive you, or do you take control of the technology? And what's fascinating to me is over the last pretty much 3 decades, to an extent, we really let the technology dictate how we saw our images, because we had no choice, and that was called film. So film negative would interpret the light values and the lighting curve, and then the film print would really define the colors. And the way those colors were interpreted or read was really defined by the manufacturers, Kodak, Agfa, Fuji. And the creative process was having enough knowledge and experience with how these different processes worked to create then an interpretation of what was on set. So the production, and if we think of that, I mean, this is an incredibly verbose answer, so I'm sorry. But if we think of it in the most extreme example, if we take the intent of having a film in black and white, it's how that black and white interprets the tone scale on the set. So a production designer will, and especially makeup, will have to make some concessions to how the film print and the film negative would interpret the skin tones and the set. So that there was that two-way exchange between knowing enough about the different processes, but also having the process, define how this would work. And then that then rippled through the production, where production designers would have an experience and with how the film print would interpret these scenes. So that ultimately was the craft of filmmaking, and that there was a collective knowledge of how you would read the scene and how you would light the scene. So lighting was not just lighting, it was the choice of your filters and the choice of your print stocks and that whole process of craft. So what's fascinating is over the last, say, 3 decades, as we've moved from film, a very organic, pigment-based way of interpreting colors, to digital, where we've approached more and more this ideal of having the ability to have a true and accurate representation of what we see on set. So we are almost at the point where what you see on set is what you could see on projection. And you can see that all taken to the max with Peter's work and his high frame rate. where then they're also taking the idea of motion even further. Now, that intersection or that almost scale between a very interpretive way of producing your imagery through to the pursuit of an absolute true and accurate representation of film, it can involve a lot of technology. So what I consider my role is to be across that and to help in that process of how could we get this green that we really like on set to reproduce on the screen. And there's sometimes a bit of resistance or criticism that's very technical, and we should never let our technology dictate our imagery. But I actually consider it the exact opposite. And that's to quote Professor Alexander Kluger, who was part of the Oberhausen film manifesto with Werner Herzog and Wim Wenders, and also worked with Adorno at the very start of the Frankfurt School of Marxism. He made a quote once when I was doing some work with him, which has always stuck with me, and that's, using the very tools that are used to oppress us, we will take back our dreams. So wow. I feel that rather than criticize technology and say, well, it's not, we should never let it dictate what we want to do, I feel that we should take control of the technology and make it serve us and have an understanding of how we can get to where we want to be. And then if that's presented to the filmmakers, and particularly in my little world, it's very much the DP, director, and production designer. That's like, they're the kind of, that's the holy trilogy that I answer to. And that's, what is it that you want to do? Okay, well, we could try this and we could try that. How does that work? And then it becomes an interpretive process, and therefore a collaborative process. So, yeah, and then on a personal level, to answer your question, how do I calibrate my eyes? It's actually in that process of establishing visually what is the hope, rather than just looking at some references and going, okay, we can copy that. So rather than always doing an homage or making something retro, it's more of an interpretation. So in terms of calibrating my eyes, it's never really a question of trying to change how I view it. It's really learning how everybody else is learning it, and that's all part of this fantastic new field that really does seem to be starting, say, in the last few years, which is color linguistics. And that concept that the very words that we use to describe color affect how we, in fact, perceive color. And that fascinates me, because I've always felt that color theory and, opening up your Mansell book and saying, well, the harmonious color of our lavender should actually be a green, that to me has always been a little lightweight, and it ignores many, many cultural questions, whereas acknowledging that becomes interesting. So to answer your question, how do I calibrate my eyes? It's not a question of actually calibrating. It's really more of an understanding. And it's a bit like when you meet a bunch of people from different countries, you really try to find that common language and then have that forward motion.
That makes absolute sense. And it's such a cool concept for that idea of moving your sort of creative palette or your vision from one project to another. Is you're starting by being a really good student and a really good listener, it seems like, in figuring out, okay, what are we trying to do? And then doing something that I see throughout your career, and I totally agree, is the way we should be engaging with technology, which is to think about the technology and the processes and the systems at your disposal, and then to really tailor an end-to-end pipeline of like what's happening in between this sensor and the screen, and how can I make it best agree with what I now understand to be the desired aesthetic or the creative intent of the particular work that I'm doing.
Yeah, because I think the thing to understand is to, I mean, without making it too political, is to not be victims or passive, but to actively engage. And the first thing is that, film stocks were actually made, certainly they were made by companies and very large companies, but they were actually designed and built by people. So wouldn't it be interesting to actually ring up those people and go, this is what we're doing, what are you doing? And then out of that, you could find something interesting. So, with the Fuji stock, there was Hiro-san, who was working on the, we for the original Lord of the Rings, that there was a particular Fuji film stock we were using, but we weren't really able to get the particular kind of blues / cyan that we wanted. So by really speaking with Fuji, it seemed to be a pretty easy tweak. So they really did change the chemistry and released a new print stock, which became the base of that film, which was an amazing thing to do. And even with Kodak at the time, there was talk of being able to do kind of customized film stocks, because it's something, in fact, I was just chatting with some filmmakers yesterday about, is that it really is about 10 years ago that film print stocks kind of finished off. And to give you some idea, it was on one of the last of the Harry Potters, we were typically making print runs of 27,000 prints. So the sheer scale of that meant that both Fuji and Kodak were absolutely at the zenith. They were really at the peak of their technology of print stocks. And, there was like the 5218 print stock came out, but there was like a little issue with its sensitivity to infrared, which whilst it looked pretty good for skin tone, it was a nightmare to work with in a film lab because all your little infrared lights would actually fog the film. So then out of that came the 2219. So at the time, the ability to modify chemistry was absolutely at its peak. And then because the digital came through and the whole other reasons, it's really taken a while for digital to kind of catch up to that ability of people being in control of their technology and being able to respond to the market. So I really think in the last 5 years, what's become exciting is really the explosion of the 3D lookup table, which at the time really wasn't a big thing. But now that color science has really become firmly established in the process of color grading, it's now really a fantastic time to be color grading with digital tools, because our manufacturers and there's a lot of independent consultants around that are able to respond and to come up with different ideas as it was at the time with the filmmakers. So in Norway, there's a fantastic university with a very strong color science faculty who are doing some really great things. Obviously, the Rochester Institute of Technology, with their involvement with Munzel, and there's a university in Zurich who are also doing some really very interesting things with color in terms of film restorations and print stocks. So there's a lot of very interesting things around, and to be able to tap into that and really have the attitude that if the software package that I have does not do what it is we want, let's just build it.
Yes. I mean, I think you're touching on what I find to be the most exciting and most challenging aspect of like contemporary digital color grading, where it's like we have everything potentially inside of the box, and we have the potential to be able to iterate and develop very quickly, and to say like, hey, let's build half a dozen different, kind of creative print stocks if we want to do that for a different picture and try different things out. We have a better ability to do that inside of a box than even, as you mentioned, like Kodak and Fuji at their zenith. They're still dealing with an organic analog compound and the chemistry thereof that are just complicated and slower, I would imagine. So we've got all this like potential and opportunity. And the big challenge now is like, how do we like skillfully wield it, I think, which again is part of what has marked your career from the very beginning, of figuring out like, all right, we've got this massively powerful system. How are we going to work within it in accordance with our creative goals?
Yeah, it's also, I think, a question of not clogging up the creative conversation. And again, it keeps coming back to that idea of language. So if for example, Joel Cohen has just finished Macbeth, shot by Bruno Delvino, and it's being premiered at the New York Festival next month. So the overall brief was for that to be black and white. So you go, okay, that's great. And then the next question is, okay, so what are we thinking? Are you doing a theatrical release or a streaming or a film print release? The response is definitely a contemporary theatrical release. So that means digital projection and then streaming. So to give an example of how it becomes interpretation and language, the reality is that you cannot release a black and white DCP. There is no such thing, because there are no achromatic digital projections, well, outside the medical industry.
Right.
So in the medical industry, you can have a true achromatic, true black and white monitor, but the digital cinema chain is color. That's the way it is. So that immediately would seem to be a downside, because you can't have true black and white. But the upside of that is that now you are not passively held to the actual white point of the black and white film stock that is handed to you, whether you use Tri-X or Orvo or whatever. You now have this ability to take control of the actual white point that you project. So it means that whilst you can't project pure black and white on a DCP projector, that's the downside. The upside is you can actually control whether it's a warm black and white, whether it's a cold black and white. You could even dynamic across it and all of that. Now, the thing is to sit down with these filmmakers and make the statement, well, there is no such thing as a black and white projector, and you're going to be able to control the white point. I mean, you would just be using language that just makes no sense whatsoever. So it's a funny thing, but an old colleague of mine that I worked with for a long time, the late Andrew Lesney, the DP, would say it's always about presentation. So rather than sit with the filmmakers and say, well, you can't really do black and white because you can only do a color projection, it's more about we can do this black and white imagery, but we can now control whether it's warm or white, and then to present language that the filmmakers can hang on to So, for example, both Joel Cohen and Bruno are very big photography or photographic print collectors. They both have amazing collections, and they're very aware of photographic printing. You know, old school darkroom. So if you then make the kind of the comparison to, well, you could have this as you could have this look quite creamy, like the famous Japanese seagull paper print, or you could have this look like a platinum palladium print. By finding, and again it's language, by finding that common reference and not being too stuck with the interpretation, you can then build a common language, even though it's completely jargon and slang, and anybody new to the world wouldn't actually have a clue what anybody is saying. But at that point in time, for this film, for this process, for these 200 hours that we're grading, we're all using a common language where we all kind of have the general idea of what it means. So that meant that we could go into making this film that would be released in the filmmaker's mind as black and white, but technically it's being released as a color image that's truly desaturated, where we are controlling the white point. So rather than just presenting a black and white image on the screen and going, okay, well, it's coming up as D6000 because it's a DCP, we can control it. So that the reality is that we were able to very subtly dynamic and change from warm to cool throughout the whole film. And that was something that nobody had actually even thought of before, but that was, say, like my contribution, which was, okay, we're going to do black and white. Great. What's black and white?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think that's so fascinating, and to me speaks to really the heart of what it is to be an excellent colorist, where you're talking about doing two things really skillfully. First, if I think about your initial response and the background and skill that you bring to, well, how would we actually do a truly black and white reproduction, and like understanding the technologies that are going to be harnessed in that process. There is probably no one else in the world, no artist in the world, who's better qualified than you to sort of help arbitrate that conversation. And yet that's not enough. And if you had only stopped there, and as you mentioned at the start of your response just now, turned around and then dumped all of that technical jargon and those raw considerations on your collaborators, you probably would have failed in your charge to support and sort of shepherd their vision to life. So it's like there's understanding what needs to happen on that more technical sort of like machine language of the process type of level. But then, as you keep referring to, using language that is meaningful and visceral to collaborate and to get everybody where they want to be, and make it a pleasurable process that everybody's bought into and feels like an active and meaningful participant in. That's so fascinating.
Well, yeah, it might sound incredibly trite, but it really is about respect and empathy. And that if you, I've had the pleasure and blessing to work with, say for example, a director such as Joel Cohen. When Joel gives a note, the note is not something like, could you make it darker and put a window here and give me a little more contrast? The note really is, at this point, this beat in the film, we want this to feel a little more angst, and we want the tonality to feel kind of dark and heavy. Yeah. That gives me then the space to respond with an interpretation using like my tools and go, okay, well, we could do this and this. Does this feel dark and angst? And that's kind of what we always expect of our filmmakers as colorists. I don't think any of us really want to be like micromanaged and told exactly the buttons to push. But frankly, it actually goes the other way. I don't think any filmmaker wants to be told that they have to have the language and the understanding of the tools that we're using. So that we need to be able to respond in a common language and not and to give the filmmakers the space to then be able to interpret, to say, okay, well, we can get a black and white image for, in this example as an anecdote, we can get up on the screen a black and white image. That's absolutely no problem. Here are a couple of considerations that we could actually have a play with. The first thing is, how do we get to black and white? And that's a discipline that's been in filmmaking for 100 years. Do we use a green filter? Do we use a red filter? Do we use an orange? Do we go for really, glowy skin? Do we go with very dark skin? And then you kind of narrow that down, and you can maybe make some references and go, okay, well, if you think of the black and white work of Helmut Newton, who always had very stark contrast in skin tones because he was typically using a green filter. If you think of like all the the black and white work of Richard Avedon, he was using very much sort of platinum palladium printing, so quite warm but very very hard contrast. So they're all the kind of considerations that we can think about. And the second is, straight up, if you think of black and white films, through the 20s and 30s, I mean, they were tinted, that, they would be blue and green, and there'd be a whole assumption there. So, let's have a play and see what it would look like to start to tint it. And obviously, I think these days to go with like completely red and blue, that's not appropriate, say, in this case. But it did raise a very interesting area, and that's like an investigation of, well, this could work, and it's that investigation and that process of knowing enough of your technology to be able to control it, so that when the filmmakers go, well, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. What happens if we go further? Or what happens if we go down that road? Or can we just get it looking, it's looking too hard. What could we do? And it's that, to answer your really original question, it's that dialogue and investigation that I find interesting, and particularly sitting there with the idea of, well, if it's not available today, let's work out what we want to do, and I'll just get it built.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I mean, that leads me to something I'm dying to ask you about, which is this: you've had this ability and this penchant throughout your career for doing exactly what you just said, which is saying, well, I need this, and this doesn't exist. I need to build it. Let's build it. And we can go all the way back to like the Lord of the Rings, when you were working on the color grading on the pipeline for those films, and you essentially, if I understand correctly, you basically had to commission custom software in order to do that. Is that right?
Yeah. I think if you think of Lord of the Rings, certainly they finished shooting around the late 2000s, which meant the original project, or the idea of it, was really kickstarted around 98, 99. Now the whole the whole team of that was with Barry Osborne, the producer, and Andrew Lesnie, who at the time was shooting Babe 2 over in Australia, and all sorts of people. And the brief was, how could we grade a feature film rather than a commercial? Because I think if we really remember at the moment, or nowadays, that there's a lot of movement from this theatrical cinematic world into commercials and into photography. So that famous phrase of, well, we want it to look cinematic. I think what a lot of people have maybe forgotten is certainly in the 90s, television and TV commercials were very strong. So there, and at the time, you could shoot on your neg. You would have your telecine, and you had the beginnings of the digital technology. And because it was only like 30 seconds, it was kind of containable. So there was actually quite a degree of flow from the commercial world into the theatrical world. And also at the time, with music videos, because they were quite a big thing, with the launch of MTV. So aesthetically, there was a lot of very creative activity happening in the music video world and, in fact, the commercial world. And those aesthetic considerations, which were made possible because of the technology that was available, could not really be considered by filmmakers doing a filmmake world. Because if we remember years ago when George Miller first made Lorenzo's Oil, the original intent of that film was to, in fact, start black and white, and for the entire duration of the film, fade through to color. That was vaguely possible in the research labs of Kodak at the time making the Cineon, but just practically and financially, it just would have been very, very, very difficult. So the flow of aesthetics, or the flow of the creative considerations from commercial and music video world into the theatrical world was sort of a one-way traffic that way, rather than how it is these days, which is like the other way. So at the start of Lord of the Rings, it really was the discussion, how could we bring these tools to the filmmaking world? And the first thing was, well, the reality is we're going to have to be able to do this for 3 hours. So the idea of, if you think of it at the time, the big high-end commercials, like a 30-second grade, could take, a couple of days. That's not going to work for 3 hours. So at the time, we investigated whether we could use a couple of, for example, flames and all of that, but it just wasn't viable to just get the sheer throughput of work. And it was also technically, it might even be impossible to conceive of these days, but at the time, disk storage was a big deal, and also bit depth. So we really wanted to be able to record back to film with at least a 12-bit log or a 10-bit log file, or at least a 12-bit. And there really wasn't any digital package available that could do that, because at the time the Flames were only like 8-bit with the reality engine and all of that. So that crystallized into a brief. We need a package that will allow us to grade, but it needs to be at least 10-bit log or a bit depth of 12-bit. And we need to be able to scale it across a few things, and then we need some other color calibration. And at the time, I spoke to various manufacturers who felt that it was either too early, or they really weren't the first, that they just felt that wasn't really a market. So eventually I did find some software guys, and they built a package, and then that kind of worked from there. So, and then these days, the big thing is actual manipulation and color science. So working with the different, so that the kind of the big thing now is color appearance models, and are we in fact grading in the best color spaces, and is in fact RGB really the best way to grade? Yeah. And what's proving interesting is the answer is yes and no. And certainly in the last few years, certainly ASUS has done some great work to really help just calm things down and to give us a kind of good base from which we can wrap our different things. That, so that now the idea of a scene referred and a display referred, that all makes sense. But what I think is the new frontier is this idea of color appearance models, and really being able to truly grade in the space that we are looking at.
Like a perceptual, more perceptually uniform type space?
Yeah, because at the moment, if you think, we work in our big fat, ACES CCT, or the, ARRI wide gamut, these huge big color spaces, and then we're ramming all of that through a lookup table or LMT, whatever. So it means that the in the most simplest terms, the control that's called red isn't actually being seen as red; it's actually being seen as like burgundy, and that's what we're all used to. And so there's a lot of the guys, say the commercial world, that'll go kind of commando and just will grade in display space, and that's fine. That can work for them, but it can be problematic for other things. So I think that's kind of what's interesting. Well, that's kind of the new frontier at the moment.
That's fascinating, and brings me to something else I really wanted to ask you about, which is, if we think about this evolving frontier of like working in a proper sort of scene referred workflow up until the very tail of the chain, where we are targeting a particular display for a particular deliverable, and different color management solutions that like ACES kind of began the evolution of, and that we now have different answers to. Like in my Resolve, I have my Resolve color management in addition to ACES, and in your Baselight, you have the TCAM system, and Baselight actually, I think, even does a better job of kind of offering up all these options, like a tasting menu to the artist, of like, well, do you want to have an ACES pipeline? Do you want to have a TCAM pipeline? Do you want to use Aries pipeline? Like all these different options. And what I find fascinating and overwhelming is, like, after I went through that initial learning curve of understanding color management, then coming to understand, like, oh wait, so like even though they're both technically sound, like Aries answer to getting from big fat dynamic range color gamut down to say 709 or even 1000 nit PQ, their solution to that isn't going to visually look identical to Baselight's solution or to Resolve's solution. Like, what's the deal there? How can that be? And how do I, as an artist, navigate that and make the right choice? Like, it's a crazy, overwhelming thing. I guess I'm just curious if you, like, how you think about that and manage that.
Yeah, well, I think I think it's a matter of just choosing, or picking and choosing what it is you want to learn. So to take on the whole idea of to be a color scientist and to do a PhD in it, that's not really where I want to be, because there's also way too many considerations that is beyond my skill set. So, I suck at maths. So therefore, color science is just not going to work for me, because I wouldn't have a clue how to navigate through the kind of the maths that involved. But I think to at least have a solid understanding of how your imagery is being affected, so that you can then take control of it.
Yeah.
So to understand what a color space is can be very helpful, because it then means that at least you can kind of understand or take control of that. And then the second thing is basically tone mapping and gamut mapping. Whilst it's just incredibly complicated and there's a million ways to go about it, I think understanding just the process of that then means that you yourself can take control, and then when you see something, you go, well, that's because of that. So I can resolve that. And I think the other thing is to really make your software developers your friend.
Sure.
Because they're going to have a much better idea of what's going on than yourself. And whilst it's expensive, it's also just having your own R&D time to just really try stuff yourself.
That makes sense. And it seems like you've engaged with software developers and color scientists and other professionals within this space in the same way you've talked about being a really generous and attentive collaborator with the filmmakers that you work with. It seems like you've really collaborated well and treated as equals and experts and valuable members of the team all of those role players, image scientists, developers, all the folks that help facilitate, hey, this doesn't exist and I need it to. How can I make it so, since I don't have a master's in color science and I'm not like a mathematician and I don't understand code? It seems like you've really figured out how to collaborate well with the folks that can help you support those ambitions.
Yeah, well, it's like that old saying, pick your battles. Let's say to build a lookup table, there's plenty of packages and just about all the packages allow you to get there. But it's really knowing what are you trying to do with this lookup table. And that's, if you're going to use it for grading, or are you going to use it for gamut mapping? And it's also a question of fear, because if you get booked to do a large film and it's 150, 170 million dollars of budget, do you want to be the guy that throws out there a lookup table that's just discovered at the last minute to actually have some like huge problem in the cyan? I mean,
yeah, it breaks down there.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't have I'm just not man enough to do that. That's when you call in a professional, because that's what they do. And again, it's that idea of, rather than micromanage, it's really you give the brief to the expert, because they will then be able to bring to the table their experience.
Yes.
And then they're going to go, okay, well, we can do that, but you might want to consider this, this, and this. And you go, oh, okay, that's a good idea. And especially if you work with the manufacturers, for example, with Dolby and their Dolby Vision, in the early days, the projector was actually being driven with an HDMI, and then we discovered that they were actually using the SMPTE full, which is different to normal full. There's 4-bit depth difference, which for 99% of the imagery you wouldn't really notice. But if you find yourself working on an extremely subtle low light imagery, and you're noticing that there's this kind of almost dithering or some kind of like noise in the blacks that doesn't really make sense, to then actually ask, and then you discover that that's the case. So it's like you can't know everything, and you can't be an expert in everything. And it's particularly in some of these industrial processes, or particularly the conversion technologies. Because you could say, as a colorist, we assume that there's a pipeline that's working, but that pipeline ultimately is just a couple of conversions bolted together. Mm-hmm. So we have a camera sensor that's converting light, and then we have a display technology, that's converting a digital signal to an analog. So you could argue that as a colorist, we are sitting in the middle of a pipeline that's ultimately about conversion technologies, and that our job is to build palettes and tonalities based on the assumption that that our imagery will be displayed in the same way that we're seeing it. So, and I am not an expert in conversion technologies at all, but there are people, obviously, Howard Brendel and the team over at ARRI, and Graham over at Red, and then the Sony team, and the different display technologies. If you kind of tap into that world and leave that to the experts, I think that can then make your job a lot easier, because you can go, well, that's not a grade, that's actually a tweak in my gamut map, for
Right.
example. And
Right.
it's almost like really just getting your parameters locked down, so that then you don't have to do all this like hand tweaking.
That completely makes sense. And I think there's a really important lesson for all of us listening to you share your insights and experience that you professed. I'm not an expert in this stuff. It's not my passion or my field of study. And yet you're very curious about it. Like some of the examples you've already given, it seems to me that at least in a few examples, like the slight scaling, like tonal scaling thing that you just mentioned with the Dolby projection, I imagine you had to ask a question more than once for someone to take you seriously and say, oh, you're right, there actually is a little mismatch there, or something that could be tuned or calibrated better. I imagine you had to be curious, a little persistent, and collaborative in order to scratch that itch, right?
Yeah, well, it really, it always comes down to the famous, show me. So if you really if you can really set it up so that you can show, well, if I do this, this happens, and if I do this, this happens, but it doesn't make sense that I need to do this.
Uh-huh.
What's that? And everyone can then start to think about it.
Yeah. How cool. I've got another subject that I want to discuss with you that I feel like you are you're very future facing in this area, where we've thought historically, obviously, quite a bit about color reproduction and tone mapping, and in recent years more about like, oh, how can we target multiple displays, and how does HDR affect the way we think and operate? But one of the things that I see you talking about a lot and working with a lot is like texture, and specifically MTF. Can you teach us about what's up with MTF? Why should I care about it? And how do you as an artist think about it from end to end and work with it?
Why should we care about MTF? Well, if we think of if I'm always a fan of looking at the photography world, because the photographic world has one advantage. Well, it has many advantages in that it really is just yourself, and you're producing a couple of prints, and it's just a moment in time. So you don't actually you don't have to deal with temporal considerations. You don't actually have to deal with 24 frames. You can there's a lot of things you can just do with a print. And so if we just kind of remove the baggage of trying to make a film where you have all the time considerations, the thing that photographers live and die by is their lens. The Leica versus the Voigtlander, and they'll do all sorts of things that, they'll just breathe on the lens, they'll just put Vaseline, there's just, or hang little trinkets in front of it, or get some little fishing wire to just hang it across in front of the lens to give a flare. There's just, you're always trying to do something to the image to render it in interesting ways, or visually pleasing, or confrontational ways. And then you're printing it, and then you are always choosing the kind of paper and the kind of chemistry, if it's the old days, or sharpening. So there's that process is always a consideration, and it's part of it. You get your tonality, you get your color, and then you get your sharpening to really make it very simple. And whether it's like it's calmed down now, but a few years ago, particularly in advertising, if we think of sports, I don't know, all the ads for sporting clothes, they were as sharp as hell. They were, that was the aesthetic. And then if we think of lifestyle ads from like the 90s where everything had a fog filter on it and everything was glowy and soft, but that thing, that texture is a consideration. So then if we take that into the feature world, one consideration is whatever we do to the image, we will have to deal with it for at least 2 hours. So if we're going to make a really soft, glowy, fantastic image that looks great as like a single photographic print, are we going to be able to sit through that for 2 hours, or is it just going to get in the way of the storytelling? And then likewise, the super sharp, super high contrast aesthetic, again, is that going to work for 2 hours, or are our actors just going to get evaporated and just we'll never actually we'll just see these like graphic shapes with some voices. So that's one consideration. The second is that the DPs live and die by the lenses. There's a huge fashion at the moment for anamorphics and vintage anamorphics in front of a digital sensor, and Panavision Series Cs. Panavision have like truly emptied out. There are no anamorphic lenses that you can rent at the moment. Just everybody's doing anamorphic. And if you get like a Panavision C series and drop that down to like 2.8, that is not a sharp image at all. But it's a beautiful image. It's very aesthetically pleasing, and it's a very engaging image depending on the story. Likewise, if you get the Zeiss master primes and run those at like T5.6 or something, they are as sharp as all hell. They've got amazing contrast, and again, that's appropriate. So that whole consideration, which is driven by the story and the actors, I mean, that's all about flair and MTF. How sharp is it, or what's the MTF on it? Likewise, the flair is therefore how bloomy. So that once you have that image, as a file, you can then take it also and contribute or destroy that. So just as you could get you could shoot something, say, on an Arri A60, let's say something like the work of Philippe Rousselot. You could shoot with the latest Leica lenses on an Arri A65 and then light the set so that you really are running at like T5.6. That is like the sharpest, amazing image. It's like crystal. It has the way the Leicas render the image. They're kind of the way their flares work. It's like this amazing crystal. Again, it's a very beautiful image. But you have a 6K image, and you're going to display that on a 4K projector. So you have to down-res it. In that process, that one button, you could just destroy everybody's work that they have spent years of R&D in getting the perfect MTF. Because if you go from 6K to 4K, if you use a Lancos or a Gaussian or whatever, you can just truly just destroy the image. And if you down-res, and let's say a typical mistake, you would call up a Lancos 6 tap, but run it in linear. That just then means in HDR, you're just going to have all this ringing, and you're going to have this noise. So you basically will have just destroyed the image. So it's marrying your tools to what they're doing on set. So my obsession with the MTF is really because it's the frequency response, and what you're doing digitally, you are picking up from what the guys were doing on set. So if you take an absolute typical example of like a close-up, you can blur the image so that the skin tone looks quite soft and all of that. But then if you sharpen the extreme high frequencies, you will bring back the eye light,
Mm-hmm.
and that then suddenly you've now given access to your actors in terms of their performance, or as an actor such as Russell Crowe would refer to, is the wetness of the eyes, because actors are, it's no big surprise, they're always working with their eyes. So you really want to be able to access what's going on there. So you want a sharp image that gets all that details, the wetness in the eyes, if the actors are kind of starting to tear up on a performance. So you want a sharp image, but you don't want a super sharp image where the skin tone just looks awful, or the pores of the skins look hard, and that you're really making it a very unattractive image, and that you're then introducing all sorts of technical considerations. If there's fine pattern in the clothing, that's all moiraying. So that means that you can just change the frequency response, or your MTF. So basically you can blur the image, or that it's soft, up until the point of your highlights, which can be quite sharp.
It's sharp.
And then you can sharpen that in. So it's exactly the same as in music or music mixing, where you're equalizing for tone or treble. It's exactly the same thing. And so you can do that digitally with a lot more control, just as the DPs will do. So in the old days, if you were shooting with diffusion, you wouldn't just shoot with one diffusion for the whole film. You would have different sets, from the close-ups to the wides and all of that. So that's why I think that's important, because it's actually the texture of the image, and it's also the flare, the blooming, and how the colors kind of interact together.
That's so fascinating, and it just seems so much more important when you get out of the 100-nit container of SDR. I mean, it of course matters there as well, but I know for me, with the more work I do with HDR, and when I'm looking at an image and a new frame will pop up, and I'll go, oh, that's a little crunchier, like the contrast is a little heavy there. And I often find myself going like, well, is it contrast, or is it texture, or is it a little bit of both in terms of where this needs to go? They're so intertwined, and you really can't, you can no longer, I feel like I got away in my practice. Maybe I'm just a careless artist, but I got away in my practice with SDR for many years without ever really thinking about texture, besides like, oh, let's add some film grain, or let's soften it a little bit overall. But you're talking about using an equalizer, like you mentioned, and I'm really playing with like, all right, at this section of the MTF, do I want to go softer? Do I want to go sharper? And really sculpting that in accordance, again, with that kind of creative brief and creative vision that you have worked out with your collaborators. It's such a new frontier, I feel like.
Well, they always, everyone always used to use that. I mean, in the old days, there was a optical printer at the Technicolor North Hollywood labs that everyone would prefer to use, the number 7, because they had the latest dichroic filters. Or yeah, I mean, again, if we think of like music videos in the telecine days, where people were doing all sorts of things, you would shoot on neg, but then you would do the filters on the telecine chain, or there was all sorts of really wild and crazy stuff. It's just taking that out of the slightly randomized, rather unpredictable world, and just putting it into the digital world, where you can control it and to modulate it really across 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about exerting such granular control and about having iterative control to say, oh no, that's actually a little too much of that. I'm going to pull that back. Both of which are new things that are obviously very powerful, but they put new onus on the colorist and other filmmakers involved in those decisions to really nail it, because you do have so much more control, right?
Yep. Yes, and it's and I think the audience appreciates that. I think the viewing audience is quite sophisticated now because everyone has a pretty decent display. I mean, if you think about the quality of iPhones and iPads, I mean, they now have become the de facto review tool these days. So, basically you could argue that just about everyone really is viewing on a 2K P3 really quite decent monitor. And they also have access with their own imagery, with their own tools, with Instagram and all the rest of it. So this process of giving a look, everyone, it's become part of the vernacular. So as a colorist, you kind of need to keep up with everyone, frankly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Peter, I feel like maximum another 9 or 10 hours and I could get my first list of questions answered from you. But since I can't co-opt your entire day, I want to wrap up today by asking you about sort of charting a career, both in terms of like a being successful creatively, but also professionally. Let's say I'm a year one colorist or a year two colorist, and I'm really committed. I'm all in. I want to do this thing. I want to cultivate my craft, and I also want to, like make a living doing it. What prescription would you give me? Do you have any advice to offer?
Well, uh, I think find yourself some collaborators, filmmakers that kind of you can work with. And I think just be aware that you are playing with some pretty big dollars. If you pick up a big, Netflix series or an Amazon series, that's you are taking on quite a responsibility because you are creating the final product. So I think whatever you do at whatever scale, to make sure that basically, I guess in shorthand, that you can get stuff out the door, that your product really will pass QC, and that all technically it will actually deliver what's required, to take the delivery specs seriously. And if you as the colorist feel that that's not really your area, you'll need to make sure somebody's in charge of that, because otherwise, yeah, it's like as a studio, they're going to go, well, this person's fantastic, and they're going to be able to, bring an enormous amount of creativity to the table. That's great, but how do we get our master that's going to be, technically up to standard and will work? So I think as a colorist, you'll need to look at your team or put together I guess in summary is to not be a lone wolf.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Because the stuff's going to break. So are you going to swap out your graphics card, or
Are you going to build that LUT that ends up breaking in the cyans or whatever?
And then you get your EDL turned over. It's like okay, and there's now 1,000 visual effects shots, but there was a change of heart. Are you going to go through and do this by hand yourself? I think it's just take a bit of a holistic approach to, I guess in really brutal terms, where you want to be in the great cog, in this great machinery.
Yes.
To be the freelance guy that kind of just swans in, does the grade, and kind of wanders off, that can work. but then that just means you'll need to build that relationship with the facility to make sure that that's kind of working. So I think that would be the main thing, because there's a lot of independents now that are great, but they can't offer everything else that's also needed if you're delivering something to a studio or Netflix. So I think that's really just working out where you want to be in the greater scheme.
Well, what it also sounds to me like is what I think is great advice, which is, okay, there's most new colorists, I would venture, are worried about how am I going to get the opportunities. And it sounds like part of what you're saying is you should probably be making sure that you know how you're going to deliver like fantastically on those opportunities when they do come your way, and that you have a plan and a roadmap for, okay, here are the parts that I can do well and the boxes that I can tick. And here are the things that I don't want to touch or can't touch that I'm going to rely on person X or Y to support me with, so that I can actually make good on this opportunity once it does present itself.
Yeah, I mean, I keep hearing that the industry is changing, and it'll go like the sound industry, where there'll be the houses where they do all the services except the mix, and then the mixers, as freelance, will come in. I keep hearing that predicted, but I haven't quite seen that happen. I think, and it actually depends on the market as well. That LA is very different to London, which again is very different to New York. But I think if you're a younger colorist starting up, the thing that I would suggest is to avoid trying to rebuild a big facility, or to be aware that if you are taking on a big 8-part series for Netflix or Amazon or a big studio picture, it's not just the grade. There's a whole bunch of other things involved. And if you look at a typical DI or a post budget, the grade is a certain component. The deliverables are actually a larger component financially. And, do you do deliverables yourself? So I think the smart thing to do would be to partner up, or at least have discussions with some facilities to go, okay, if I get a grade, can I come into your place and do the grade? And then just clarify, okay, who does what and all of that. And then that would be the first thing that I would be doing if I was starting today. I'd make sure, I had my own like little system, but then I would sit down with some of the bigger facilities to go, okay, is this going to be possible? If I have a project, I can bring it to the room where then your guys handle the conform and the deliverables and everything else. Because otherwise it can just, if you're a little boutique, you take on these monster productions that they'll just kill you.
Yeah, I can vouch for that firsthand. That early in my career, being like, cool, I got this thing, and like, man, like we're really vibing creatively, and like the grade looks awesome, but the job's not done at that point. You got to deliver all of these, in some cases, exotic and far-flung and ever-changing formats and standards. And if you don't deliver on that, then like the last impression is the lasting impression, right? And that doesn't do anyone any favors to like flag at the like finish line there.
Yep.
Well, that's great advice, and I'm so grateful for the time that you've given us this morning, Peter, and for sharing your experience and insights, and for I feel smarter just listening to you talk about this stuff. I don't know if that's actually the case, but I feel that way. So I'll go into my day feeling a little more educated and capable of making the magic of color grading happen.
Or at least know how to be verbose.
So. Well, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, I mean, that's half the battle. For ultimately being a visual product that we're producing, language and dialogue is such an integral part of what we do. So absolutely, I'm going to take that lesson too.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you for your time. It was very interesting to think about this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Peter. I hope to cross paths with you again soon, and happy grading until then.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.